This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Nick Larkey! Stevenson with his own move. Carrington. North are in front!
Hello and welcome back once again to North Pod. And big episode for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the AFL trade period, give a bit of an overview, quick overview. Going to have a quick look at the members Q&A video that came out earlier in the week. And we are going to primarily have a look at the forward line review. So plenty to get to. Let's jump in and start with our trade news. Look, I guess first and foremost, the period doesn't officially open up until Friday 4th of October is free agency. That's probably less going to be impactful for us. Monday 7th of October is when the trade period officially opens up, and that runs until October 16, so about a week and a half there. I will have another podcast out next week sort of going over what's actually happened in the trade period, so this is a bit more of a preview, I suppose. But yeah, I've spoken about Jack Darling. He's officially requested a trade, so that's going to get done. And all the talk is that that's going to be pick 64. So our last pick, or potentially pick 58, but certainly one of our later picks will get that done. So yeah, that will happen. Luke Parker, now the grand finals happened, there's certainly been more talk. Nothing completely official yet, but all the talk is that he's also going to request a trade to North Melbourne. Like Darling, he is contracted, so again, a trade will have to get done, but given his age, I think that's going to be a pretty straightforward later pick deal as well. I don't know if the other of the 58 and 64 will get that done. But potentially it's going to have to be a little bit better than that. But either way, I think both of those are going to come across pretty cheaply on multi-year deals. I did hear that the Jack Darling trade is going to be 2 years plus an extra third year with some games played triggers. It does concern me a little bit because I would have much preferred that we only had him on the books for 2 years, and potentially that will be the case. But I guess at the end of the day, that's the price that you pay for trying to get players across at this late period of their career, and potentially maybe you have to pay them a little bit of money when they're not going to actually play. That remains to be seen, but I guess... yeah, that did concern me a little bit that it's a 3-year deal potentially. Not sure about Luke Parker, but again, it'll be a multi-year deal. So those two essentially are going to get done. And potentially by the time we're talking next about the trade period, that they may have already gotten done. Then there's a host of players that we've been rumoured to or linked to. So Dan Houston, it does seem to be kind of down to us and Carlton and potentially Collingwood. Although Collingwood yesterday had a commitment from Harry Perriman, so potentially that is going to rule Collingwood out, possibly, of going after Dan Houston. Not because they play the same role, but more so from a paying money perspective. Look, ultimately, Collingwood was going to find it tough to get that done anyway because of their draft haul, and that's similar to Carlton. So whilst we're not Dan Houston's number one preference of place to go at the moment, we certainly are in the box seat in terms of what we could offer. There's talk that we could look at using our next year's draft pick to try and move up as well. So look, I don't want to say that we're the favourite, because I think generally speaking, clubs find a way to get players to where they want to go. So I still think that Carlton is the favourite. It is just going to take some manoeuvring and some compromise, I think, probably from Carlton's side in order to make that work. So we'll wait and see with Dan Houston. I kind of get the sense that we might go after Caleb Daniel if Houston doesn't work. I don't know that we're going to go after both of those players. Caleb Daniels obviously would be a cheaper player to play, and also most likely or definitely a cheaper player to trade across. So both of those, similar to Darling and Parker, are contracted, so a deal would have to get done for them. Early days, there was some talk about potentially Matthew Owies. I think that's died off recently. I haven't heard much of that recently, and personally, I'd prefer not to go after him. I think whilst he can kick a goal, I don't know that he really helps us in the pressure department up forward. So look, we're not out of that race, but I think it's pretty safe to say that one's not happening. And then the only other one that I want to talk about in terms of this preview, Jack Martin is someone who would interest me. He's been delisted by Carlton, and so he'd be a free pickup. That's someone that would interest me as another potential option for our forward line. I know that he's not going to be a game breaker for us. He's not going to change our forward line, and he's had his injury woes, so he's a risk in that sense. But as a delisted free agent, would you prefer to give Jack Martin a go as opposed to Blake Drury or Charles Lazar or Cooper Harvey? I guess they're the questions that you might have to ask yourself. So they're all the players that we've been linked to, or I'd like us to be linked to at this stage. Next week on the pod, we'll dive a bit deeper, because hopefully by that point, some actual, trading's happening and we can kind of look at that. So like I said, free agency opens Friday, October 10, and the trade period Monday, October 7. And I think we can expect some definite trades to be made. I guess following on from that, the members Q&A was released on the North Melbourne website during the week. And look, as you'd expect, it was the lads. It was Viney, Rawlings, Thirstfield. They were giving company talk, and that's what you'd expect them to do. It was about half an hour. It's probably, definitely worth a listen if you're interested in what our strategy is going to be going into this period. They spoke about definitely targeting some experience, which, we know, and reference trying to get 3 or maybe even 4 players. So we know about Darling and Parker, and then I guess it's just who might that 3rd or 4th player be. Houston, we're certainly all in on, so but by the sounds of it at least, so I guess potentially he's the 3rd, and then, not too sure about the 4th. Maybe that's Caleb Daniel, maybe it's another that hasn't necessarily gotten out yet, but they were definitely, upfront about the fact that we're looking for some experience and hoping to get 3 or 4 players in. They also talked about being open to using our 2025 first pick and either bring that forward into this year to try and get into the draft, or potentially using that as part of our trading. And that would, I think, only be if we were going to get Dan Houston. I don't think we're moving that pick for a trade for any other player that we've been linked to. So, hold your horses if you're concerned that we're going to move our first pick from next year to try and get Parker or Darling done. That's not going to be necessary. But, all the talk is that this is a very even draft with, a good 20 to 25 players that are relatively even. Obviously the players picked up the top are going to be a little bit better, but there's certainly some discrepancies between how the players in the top 25 or so are ranked by clubs. So I think in part that's the club saying we're open to bring that pick forward, which is great. But the other part of that is I think because the draft is so even, it is going to make it difficult for us to try and split pick 2 into some later picks, because clubs are pretty confident that, players they might be interested in are going to be available later on. Now, potentially 2 is high enough that someone might be interested, but I do think it devalues, what you might be able to split it up for. If you think about last year, I think pick 2 is worth more than it is this year, just because those first couple or those first handful at the draft last year were more or less set in stone. We knew that Reed, McKercher, Dersma were going to be the top 3 or 4, whereas this year it is a little more unclear. So I guess that's just worth noting. I think they'll, as a club, we'll still be asking the question of clubs to see if we can do that. And there's going to be clubs that do have multiple picks that, could potentially theoretically work. We know that Freo's got quite a few picks. We know Richmond's most likely going to end up with lots of picks. So there are clubs that are going to have it. It's just whether or not they're going to be interested in, getting to pick 2, and which remains to be seen. But currently, before anything's happened, this draft, we have pick 2, pick 22, pick 40, pick 58, and pick 64. So ideally, you're using those later picks, 58, 64, maybe 40, to try and get Parker and Darling done, and that leaves you with pick 2 and pick 22 as potentially the 2 that you would actually want to take into the draft. But again, I think I'd expect plenty to change between now and draft day in terms of us trading picks, us trading in players. Currently we have 6 list spots available, but that's before any trading and before we've contracted Drury, Harvey, or Lazaro. So you add Darling and Parker, you're down to 4 list spots. So then it becomes, well, how many do you want to take at the draft? Do you want to take 1 at the rookie draft as well? There's been talk about River Stevens, potentially Anthony Stevens' son, getting on the list as well. So there's a fair bit to think about there. As far as I'm aware, there's been no announcement that we're going to get our list concessions where we can have a few extra players on the list for next year. So that potentially might mean that we're picking a little bit less. But yeah, that's that's where it sits for us ahead of the draft and ahead of the trade period. Obviously, plenty still to go under the bridge. It's very early days, but like I mentioned, I'll go through my thoughts and I guess what's been happening next week once the trade period's actually officially open, and we can have a look at what's actually happening. Hopefully, the Darling and Parker deals happen pretty early so that we can spend the rest of our time trying to sort out other things, and hopefully we can talk about them as when they've already happened. Fingers crossed, at least. But we know how these things tend to go in the trade period. Things do tend to drag on. All right, that is enough hypothetical talk. Let's get into the real stuff, reviewing the forward line. This is the last area of the ground that I am going to review, so if you haven't already, go ahead and listen to my defensive review and my midfield review. I will summarise it all at the end of this podcast so you can see all the numbers, but I definitely think it's worth, the context behind the numbers does mean something. So just to recap, giving each player a score out of 10, being as objective as possible, but knowing that this is a subjective thing. And for context, 10, exceptional, near-perfect season, 5, a bang average year for an AFL player, and 0, a horrible year or a reflection of really not getting any games at all. And trying my best to leave expectation aside and just look at what was the impact on the AFL football field, primarily. I do weight VFL football just a very tiny little bit. Really, it's about how did you perform at AFL level. So that's what we're doing. Going to the forward players and going through in jumper number order, which does mean that one of our retirees, Hugh Greenwood, is first up. 3 games he played, mostly at the start, in the first half of the year it was. 9.3 disposals on average, kicked a goal, 6.3 tackles, had 3 or 4 hit-outs a game. And look, we knew going into the year that he was going to be sort of trialled as that forward who can back up ruck if he was going to play at AFL level. Only got the 3 games and wasn't really able to break through beyond that. As we know, dominated at VFL level with his clearance and his tackling game. There is real strength, but it seemed as though Clarko wasn't here for him in terms of potentially his leg speed. I think it was great to have him around the club as a more mature bloke. And if there were some injuries, potentially he could have plugged some holes. But yeah, I think his age got the better of him. He retires as a 3-club player who, gave it a crack. And those of you that do listen to other North Melbourne podcasts, Marnie Cohen is a big Hugh Greenwood fan, so shout out to you, Marnie. Yeah, I think it's, he wasn't able to. He's not our future, so it made sense that we've delisted him and he's been able to retire and head on out. But yeah, the 3 games is obviously going to limit his on-field impact, so it's a 1 from me. But again, I think he probably fulfilled the needs from him this year. He's an older body and a mature head around the club, and certainly not a reflection of how good of a player he has been. Jaden Stevenson is an interesting one. 12 games, 12.7 disposals on average, 4.3 marks, 1.7 tackles, kicked 8 goals for the year. So I think we all expected a little bit from Jaden Stevenson. He had a really good first half of the year in 2023, and it seemed as though when Clarko had to step aside, Jaden Stevenson stepped aside as well. His football really went backwards during that period. I think going into this year, we were expecting, well, personally, I was expecting a bit of a recovery from him, but it didn't come. He was dropped to the VFL after the round 14 game against the Pies, and that was because he was having an indifferent year. He'd really struggled to hit the scoreboard. I thought his chasing was okay. Like, he wasn't bad at sort of trying to apply pressure, but he wasn't always able to apply enough. He did come back into the side for a couple of late games where he looked okay and was on the wing at times, so potentially there's a spot for him for next year. But all the talk is that in his exit interview, it was made pretty clear to him that he's got plenty of work in front of him if he'd like to get another contract. Next year, 2025, is his last contracted year. And yeah, I mean, he's really coming off the back of 18 pretty disappointing months. Yeah, it's been all downhill since the start of 2023. So he's 25. The time for him is now. He's not going to dramatically change as a player, but either we need to use him better or he needs to adjust. Otherwise, I think this could be it for him, which would be really disappointing. He's obviously a player with a lot of talent. It's just whether or not he's going to be able to put that together and, make it as a prolonged AFL career. I do think there's potential for him on the wing. if we could sort out a bit of his disposal. He can be a really great kick. It's his decision-making that worries me a little bit if he's playing off that halfback or wing area. You do need to make some really good decisions, and sometimes I think he can kind of just make it up as he goes. So that would be my concern. In terms of his score, I think it's a 3. He did play, half a year's worth of footy, but really didn't show much quality football, and that's the reason that he found himself back in the VFL at times. So, yeah, I think a 3 for Jaden Stevenson. Zane Dersma, our young draftee, is up next. Played 13 games, averaged 7.5 disposals, kicked 9 goals, 8 for the year, averaged 3.1 marks and 0.8 tackles per game. And I think right there you can kind of see the knock on him at times is that he's not able to apply that forward pressure, similar to Jaden Stevenson. We've got some players in that forward line who love a goal and who love the offensive side of the game, but aren't necessarily across the defensive aspects. So I think as a first-year player, you can kind of get away with a little bit of that. Coming across from, being an elite junior player, often those players aren't necessarily defensively minded, so, you take that with a grain of salt. He was the sub or subbed in 3 of the last 4 games, so, his second half of the year he played some VFL and then was a bit of a feature act in the AFL side, but yeah, he had a block of 11 games to start the year, so a really solid block there. I was a little bit surprised that he started the year, just given his frame. I thought we'd try and, put him in the VFL and develop him there at first. We kind of did the opposite. We gave him that taste of the AFL and then we developed him a little bit later in the year. He showed signs of brilliance, took a Mark of the Year contender against Richmond, a really, really fantastic leap. Kicked 2 goals on 3 occasions and took some really strong marks floating across the pack. So I think we can see the archetype of player that he is. He's a really great mark. Took 11 marks against Freo in that round 2 game. Just unfortunately this year would go missing for large chunks of games. And like I mentioned, his tackling pressure virtually non-existent, unfortunately. So definitely a skillful player. Huge potential given his height and the type of player that he is. Potential does not always mean that it translates though, so we've got to hope that he's working hard and people like Mickey Barlow at the club are working hard on developing him. I think probably for me it's a 3. That's not based on what he could become. I think he could become a really special player, but his output on the pitch this year wasn't amazing. So a 3, I could probably be convinced up to a 4, but I just don't think he played enough footy for that. So a 3, flashes of brilliance, but not a lot of substance for this year. But I think we see in the future he's got a real eye for the goal. 9 goals, 8 in his 13 games, like I said, and a lot of those he was a sub or the sub. So I think a lot of promise for Zane Dersma, and hopefully he can be getting a score of 8 or 9 next year would be fantastic. Then we come to a player in our leadership group and someone who I think was really, really hard to mark, and that's Nick Larkey. Played all 23 games, averaged 9.5 disposals, 4.5 marks, kicked 46 goals for the year, which is obviously significantly down on his 71 from last year, but for the record, still his second highest tally ever. So whilst it was a bit of a step backwards, I don't necessarily think it's a massive step backwards because his second best year ever. Was often finding the footy further up the ground due to playing that sole tall forward role for the first part of the year. Obviously Zerha's in there too, but I really don't think he plays like much of a tool. And sure, we had CCJ up there for 2.5 games. I'll talk about him in a minute. But yeah, he played a long way up the ground. I think when Teakle came in and Pink started playing forward, that did help him a little bit, but it did seem to help Zerha more, I think. That allowed Zerha to be matched up on a worse defender, whereas Larkey was still getting the best defender. He was held goalless 4 times against the Hawks, the D's, the Dogs and Port, and his maximum tally was 5, which he kicked twice, once against the Tigers and once against West Coast. And both of those are examples of where, we're playing sides that are worse, and therefore he's getting more opportunities, and therefore he was kicking more goals. By virtue of being, a full forward that is ideally playing deep, he is going to, or his success is going to directly relate to how many inside 50s we're able to generate and how clean those are. So hopefully as the side gets better, his access to the footy does get better and he can kick more bags. I do think, he still plays his best footy when he's leading a straight line and it's kicked to him out in front. I don't think long kicks on top of his head are going to work for him, and he does rely, or his style of play does rely on fast ball movement as a result. He scored a 10 last year. It's not going to be a 10 this year, but I do think I'm going to score him higher than some others probably would. I was tossing up in that 7 to 9 region, and so I've landed on an 8. I think a really hard team to play forward for this year. Still led our goal kicking. He fought through adversity. I could see it being a 7, but I think it's hard because expectations for him are very high, and I think that's possibly why people would be pushing into that 6 or 7 range. I think comparing him to the other players that got 7s, I do think he's higher than them. So Tommy Powell, Aiden Corr, Colby McKercher, Charlie Comben, Jackson Archer, they're the sorts of players that we're getting 7s. And I do think that if you're just looking at it from an output perspective, Larkey had a better output. When we talk about expectation, it's probably a little bit different. But yeah, for me, it's an 8. I thought he had a solid year. In terms of an AFL forward, wasn't amazing and did have to find more of the footy further up the ground. But I think he had a really, really solid year for us. And considering the first half of the year was just awful in terms of how much footy we were getting inside 50, I think 46 goals is a solid return. So an 8 for me. And then we moved to Callum Coleman-Jones. I referenced him before. Spoiler alert, he's going to get a 0. 3 games, hurt his Achilles on Good Friday, and that was pretty early in the game. So really, he played 2 games, averaged 6 disposals, 2.3 marks, 3.7 hit-outs. And his first 2 games were awful, unfortunately. He really was out of form, then missed the rest of the season with his Achilles injury. Similar to Jaden Stevenson, he's got a massive year ahead next year, coming out of contract, which is probably a little bit unfair on him, given that he needs to return from his injury first, but he just needs to be a legit goal threat or a legit marking threat in the forward half. And we haven't seen him be able to do that consistently yet. So a big watch on him for next year. It's tough because you never like seeing players get injured. I really do feel for him. And an Achilles injury for a player of his size and weight is going to be a challenge. But look, that's the reality of AFL football, unfortunately. So in terms of on-field impact this year, I think it has to be a 0. Paul Curtis, now a fantastic year from him. 23 games, played every game, 11.3 disposals, 3.6 marks, 3 tackles per game, 30 goals. So his highest tally ever and our second highest tally, one ahead of Cam Zerha. What a season. The only thing that I think it is worth picking him up on is he's still really, really, really conducive to giving away a free kick. 40 free kicks against for the year, so essentially 2 a game, 20 free kicks for. So for every free kick 4, he's giving away 2. And, sometimes some of those are more costly than others. But certainly 40 free kicks against is too many. There is an undisciplined side to his game, and that's something that I think he does need to work on. I think last year he was slightly down, bit of second-year blues, but he more than made up for it this year. Never kicked more than 3 goals, but on 9 occasions kicked 2 or 3 goals. So there's definitely some consistency in there. I think he had some big games early on against the Hawks and Carlton where he did kick 3, and that was when the side wasn't playing well, which I think is, it's promising that he's able to find the scoreboard even when we're not getting the ball to him necessarily very well. I think his tackling went up as the team got the ball forward more. He averaged 3.8 tackles per game after the bye, which is when the ball was finding its way into our forward line a bit more often. He's up to 59 career games now. Looks like a small medium forward of the future. Just needs to work on that body work and that discipline. A lot of those free kicks against were because he gets himself out of position and then rather than at least splitting it 50-50, he gives a push or he does something a little bit silly and gives away a free kick, which results in a turnover. And that's, I guess, what we need to work on with him. Just there's no need, or you can be frustrated, but you can't afford to let that frustration result in a turnover. Ultimately, that's what we don't need. So I think for him, it's pretty easy. I think it's an 8 from him as well. A really, really, really good year, sneaky good year, top 5 in the best and fairest. Consistency was the big thing for him. And like I said, the fact that he's able to kick 30 goals in a side that's not seeing a lot of ball forward of the 50 is a big pro. Next up, Toby Pink, who we brought in as a key defensive backup player, but ended up playing more footy in the forward line eventually. 15 games, averaged 6.9 disposals, 2.5 marks, 1.1 tackles. Ended up with 7 goals, and like I said, started the year down the defence and then played the second half of the year predominantly as a forward. Played alongside Teakle to create a bit of a taller forward line to give support to Larkey and Zerha. I think in defence he was probably a little too small at times, both in height and weight, and was often playing against some players that were just too big for him. He's not a great kick, so he's not a player that you're going to use, Xing D50 with any confidence. But that's okay so long as you don't have too many of those players down there. I think as a forward, oftentimes he was just used as a decoy, so it wasn't necessarily him getting involved with the play, but he was creating space for others, ideally. The challenge there is you do have to be dangerous as a decoy, because if you're not, then your player is just going to sag off you and essentially create an outnumber, and you're off in no man's land. He did have that brilliant first quarter against the Swans where he kicked 2, including 1 on the run. I think there was a lot of excitement about that, but besides that, he wasn't lighting the house on fire with his forward craft. Never had more than 10 disposals, which speaks to how hard he found it to find the footy. Pretty hard to rate his second half of the year, because I think structurally he played a role, but it's not a super hard role to play. Jack Darling's probably going to come in and take that exact role for 2025. So I'm not sure about Toby Pink's role for next year, and that's okay, because we've brought him in on the cheap, and there's still potentially an option to swing him down back again if need be. I think for me, in terms of his score, I'm going to give him a 3, but it is a strong 3. It's probably more like a 3.5, because I think based on expectations, he's more or less met them. I think everyone's expectations for him were that he's going to be back up, and that he's going to play a solid but a really difficult role in defence. He ended up swinging forward and played a similar kind of role forward, and I think, like I said, I think he kind of met his expectations. I certainly wasn't expecting him to play 15 games, but he did. So I think a 3 based on his impact, but like I mentioned, he was important for structure in that second half of the year, and I think sometimes whilst some fans were going, let's get this guy out, like, what's he doing? I agree he's not the future, but I do think he was really helpful to that structure. So it's a 3 for Toby Pink. Tyler Sellers, really unfortunate. I'm going to skip over him pretty quickly. Played 2 games, didn't kick a goal, averaged 1.5 disposals, took 1 mark across his 2 games. And it's tough for him because he played against the Hawks and the Cats early in the year and just didn't get near it, but we as a side also didn't get near it. He's been delisted at 193 centimetres. He is small for a key forward, but he'd been playing really well at VFL level. I understand it was a worthwhile risk, so to speak. And I think, honestly, it's a bit of a lesson to those people that are crying out for sides to pick players out of the VFL or out of the second tier because they're smashing it at that level. There are players it works for, don't get me wrong. There are always those stories of players who have been picked out of relative obscurity and come into the AFL and have an impact. But by and large, the players that are playing there are there for a reason. And unfortunately, he has a game that doesn't necessarily translate to the highest level. I feel bad for him because he would have been stoked at the start of the year, but he just wasn't able to get together, and his VFL form wasn't amazing either. It was solid, but it wasn't game-breaking. He kicked 30 goals from his 15 games at VFL level. So whilst that's a nice tally, it's not as though he was kicking massive bags every week and knocking down the door. So in terms of AFL impact, I think for Tyler, unfortunately, it's got a 0, but I do wish him all the best in the future. Cooper Harvey is another one that I'm going to have to give a 0, but that's not much of a spoiler alert because he didn't play any games. Through form and injury, a lot of that was form though. Was in goal-scoring form in the pre-season, but his pressure was questioned, so he missed the start of the year. Ended up with 12 goals from 14 games in the VFL, so you'd definitely like to see him kicking more than that. I mentioned him off the top of the podcast, yet to be delisted currently, but it could happen. There's also a chance that he could be delisted and then rookie listed, depending on what our rookie list spots look like. I just think possibly there's a fear for me that he plays a very similar role to Paul Curtis, but not as well, and so potentially this could be the last week that we see of him. I'd like to see him get rookied, but probably that's a bit of my bias. I do think the fact that he is the son of a great definitely helps him in my mind. So, yeah, look, I think he's one of those ones where he's got some talent. It's just whether or not he has enough. And you think of his old man, Brent, like, obviously, record games player. He's my favourite player of all time. And he was a star, but I think a lot of that came through immense hard work, because when you're a player of that size, you have to have a point of difference. And I guess the question mark, and I don't know the answer, is whether or not Cooper has that same work rate and determination and desire. I don't profess to know. I'm not at training every week, but the fact that he wasn't able to push for any games this year, I think, is cause for concern. God, a lot of these players, I'm going in jumper number order, and I've got so many of our forwards are in the high jumper numbers. We're up to Finbar Maley now. Also didn't play a game, therefore had no AFL impact, but I do think his VFL form and promise warrants a point. Like Braden George, who in defence, I gave him a point for his VFL form. And yeah, I think Finbar's the same. So I've given him a 1. I think he's a likely type-up forward or as a backup ruck. He's not going to become the best centre-half forward in the competition. Like, let's be honest. But he's 21. He's 197 centimetres. He could still develop into something that's worth having a toy with. Took some really big grabs in the VFL this year. Kicked about a goal a game. And yeah, I think hopefully we'll push for a debut next year. Potentially he's the sort of player that, if you want to rest Jack Darling, or if Darling's in pretty poor form, potentially you bring Maley in. I know there was a groundswell of support wanting him to play this year, but I think it was the right move to just let him develop, and then we can see this next year in 2025 if he's got it. So look, it's a generous one because he didn't play AFL footy, but yeah, I think like Braden George, those were the two kind of standouts for me at VFL level. George before he got his injury, and then Maley was pretty consistent across the year at VFL level. So a 1 for him. Eddie Ford was a very interesting one to mark. He played 18 games, although 5 of those were as the sub or he was subbed. Averaged 11.4 disposals, 4.1 marks, 1.9 tackles, kicked 15 goals, so nearly a goal a game. And potentially his best performance for the year was on Grand Final Day in the Grand Final sprint, where he finished third. He's just another one with a question mark over his defensive work, a little bit like Cooper Harvey. His marking prowess and his work rate up the ground cannot be questioned. I think as the year on, his goals did dry up a little bit, and he went in and out of games, and probably a small step back from last year. He was rewarded with a short extension, which I think speaks to how the club feels. They're a little bit unsure about him as a long-term prospect. That being said, he's only played 40 games, so there's hope yet for him. I'd be really happy to see him play as that highest lead-up forward, the one that's often getting those outlet marks on half-back or high up on the wing. I think that's where his talents are best utilised. You still want him to be able to kick, a goal or so a game, but if a lot of his disposals were up the ground, I wouldn't have a problem with that, because he is such a hard worker, and potentially I could see him spending some time on the wing as well. He does seem to have a pretty good tank. He's just a weird unit, Eddie Ford. I really love him. He's a weird unit in all the best ways. I think he's a great lad to have around. He's unapologetic himself, which I think is a really admirable trait. I really respect people who are just 100% comfortable in their own skin. Like I mentioned, it's probably a small step back from last year. Last year I gave him a 6, and so therefore I think this year it's a 5. He had an average AFL player season this year, so a 5 for Eddie Ford. He is our number 40, so we've got Blake Drury coming in next. 6 games, averaged 10 disposals, 4 marks, 1.2 tackles, kicked 3 goals across those games, and look, he's another one that is yet to be re-signed for next year. He played rounds 5 to 9, and then he was the sub in the very last game for the year. His first game for the year against the Cats was fantastic. I gave him 2 votes for the North Podium. In that game, he had 17 disposals, 2 goals, and 11 marks. He was fantastic in a really poor performance from the team. Unfortunately, he just was not able to replicate anything close to that in his other AFL games this year. Needs to tackle more as a small forward or kick goals. He needs to be doing one of those things, and he wasn't really doing either of those things in the AFL. Ultimately, a similar year to last year. He did play off half-back last year, but in terms of his output, it's pretty similar. And yeah, I think he's probably one that's likely to find himself uncontracted for next year. There is a lot of talk that he's a favourite of Clarko's, and so potentially he's He's one that sticks around on the rookie list, but yeah, I think for him, it's a 2 for me for the year. Just wasn't able to do enough on the pitch. And 3 to go, Bryn Teakle, 11 games, so about half the year, 7.3 disposals, 2.5 marks, 5.2 hitouts per game. Kicked 9 goals, so similar to Eddie Ford, nearly a goal a game. And came in, drafted mid-season, came in and played that game against the Pies in round 14, and then never missed. He played every game after that. I think he really helped Larkey and Zerha with their outputs. Potentially Zerha, like I mentioned when I was going through Toby Pink's game earlier in the podcast. Really strong mark, although he does need to find ways to get himself involved more. Whilst he's a really strong mark, his marking numbers weren't particularly high. He also allowed Sherry a bit of a chop out in the ruck, which was fantastic. We didn't need to use Larkey in that role, which I think is important. Similar to Pink, just structurally important, but in a vacuum, his impact isn't amazing. I think the fact that he only got involved mid-season makes it more impressive, but it also impacts, whether or not I'm able to score him highly. It's going to be really interesting to see how his minutes change next year with Jack Dullan coming in, but the potential for Charlie Conman to be playing forward like he did a couple of times this year. For me, it's a 4. I think he played better than Toby Pink, but only just. So I think a 4 is fair, given he only played half the year. I think you'd be looking at a 5 for him if he was drafted earlier on and was able to play the entire year. But I think a 4 is where it sits for me for him. He's structurally important, but his specific and personal input was not massive. Next up, Cam Zerha, 22 games. He only missed the 1 game in round 5. Averaged 14.1 disposals, 4 marks, 2.8 tackles, kicked 29 goals, so more than 1 per game. And a really interesting one to score, particularly when trying not to think about expectations, because I do think expectations were high. Kicked 4 against Melbourne in that game where he nearly won it off his own boot was fantastic. Kicked 3 goals 3 times against the Pies, the Crows, and the Saints, but probably just had too many of those 0s and 1s where he wasn't able to have that scoreboard impact. That's really why he's only ended up with 29, because he was up and down. He got involved more with the structure, and structure changed mid-year. I think, like I mentioned, Pink and Teakle did allow him to get those smaller defenders, or those defenders that aren't necessarily as dangerous. So that did help him. I think his tackling pressure is underrated. I thought he had a pretty good year with his pressure. And really, him and Paul Curtis are the only two that are tackling consistently in that forward line. I think, honestly, it might be time to give up on him as a De Goey type that goes through the midfield, because every pre-season we're anticipating it's going to happen, we're kind of hinted that it's going to happen, and then it just doesn't eventuate. He played so little footy through the midfield, and that's fine. I just think, we need to come to terms with the fact that that's not him. Just play really great footy in the forward line and kick goals. Reward us. We've signed him to a long-term contract now. I scored him a 6 last year, and for me, I think a 6 feels right, particularly given his start to the year. His second half was better, and he was inconsistent, but I think, similar to Nick Larkey, it's a really hard forward line to play in. So I do think you have to take that into account, and I think his output was slightly above what I would expect. So a 6 for him, or what an AFL player would expect. So I think a 6 for him is fair. And then the final player for our 2024 North Pod review is Robert Hansen Jr. Played 6 games. It was the last 6 games of the year. Averaged 8.5 disposals, 0.7 tackles, kicked 4 goals. And he was the sub or subbed in half of those games. So I think it's worth taking that into account. He wasn't playing full games of football all the time. We saw some potential in those last few games, that he has that ability to create space for others. He kicked 2 against the Dogs, so it shows he's able to hit the scoreboard. He's a slight frame, and I don't think he's ever going to be a massive frame, so he's never going to be a tackling machine, but I would love to see him, bring more than 1 or none per game, which is what he was giving most games. He ended up getting a contract for another year, so potentially now he does have the opportunity to potentially solidify a role next year. But, this year his impact was minimal. He probably only really showed promise in 2 games. So, is not going to get a high score. I think a 2 is fair for Robert Hansen Jr. based on his output. I'm keeping my expectations in check for him because I think there was a lot of excitement about his potential in the last couple of games, but we also have to recognise that he's a small body and he's not played much AFL footy, so it's going to take time if he does get there. So who knows? I'm not personally sold on him yet, but I'd love to be wrong. And I think he will get some opportunities next year to prove himself. So that is the forward line review. I will just go through the forwards first, and then I'll go through the entire list just so you can kind of get a picture for it. I will post on social media so you can see the full list and feel free to give me your feedback on that. I'd love to hear it. There's, plenty of scores that I think are absolutely debatable. So I'm not saying that, like I said, it's as objective as a person can be. There is certainly some subjectivity in there. In terms of forward summary, 0s for CCJ, Sellers and Cooper Harvey. Just couldn't justify scoring them anything based on their AFL input, or output rather. A 1 for Greenwood and for Maley, 2 for Drury and Hansen Jr., 3 Stevenson, Dersma and Pink. Bryn Teakle a 4, and then I guess this is where you look at the forwards and you go, this is why we've had such a poor year, or this is part of it at least. We've only had 4 players that have managed to score a 5 or above in our forward half. So Eddie Ford got a 5, Cam Zerha got a 6, and then Nick Larkey and Paul Curtis got 8s. So that's the forwards. Certainly not a strong area of the ground in terms of our output this season. I'll go through now the full list. And so apologies, it's not great in an audio medium, but I think it'll give you a bit of a sense for where players are at. So 0s, Hamish Free, Geordie Payne, Taylor Go, Josh Goda, Cal Coleman-Jones, Tyler Sellers, and Cooper Harvey. So all of those essentially didn't play, or when they did play in CCJ's case and Goda's case, their injuries cut their output dramatically. A 1, Braden George, Bergman, Greenwood, Maley. 2, Lazaro, Will Dawson, Griffin Logue, Biggie Newen, Drury, and Hansen Jr. And I guess it's worth remembering that, sometimes I was giving them 2s or 3s, but they're optimistic 2s or 3s, whereas some of them are really disappointing 2s and 3s. So context is everything. 3, Curtis Taylor, Phillips Hardiman, Stevenson, Dersma, Pink. 4, Shields, Stevens, Cal Dawson, Fisher and Teakle. And then we get into the players that I think were sort of, a pass mark for AFL level or above. So a 5, Bailey Scott, Jai Simpkin, Darcy Tucker, Luke McDonald, Eddie Ford. That group there is one that you look at and go, if that group were pushing into 7s and 8s, we're having a much better year. Because all of them, maybe Eddie Ford aside, should be having better years than a 5. Anyway, 6, George Wardlaw, Cam Zerha. 7, Tommy Powell, Core, McKercher, Comben, Archer. 8, those 2 forwards I mentioned this episode, Nick Larkey, Paul Curtis. 9, Luke Davies, Uniacke, and 10, Tristan Sherry and Harry Sheasel. That is my full list. Like I mentioned, I'll post it up on social media and you can hit me up with everything that I got right or wrong. Feedback welcomed, and I'll jump into the comment sections and discuss it with you. But that is the end of my player review for 2024. Next podcast, or next AFL Men's Focus podcast, we definitely will be talking about the trade period. It will have started. We'll be into the nitty-gritty of it. So you can look forward to that. Also look forward to plenty of AFLW content coming your way. I've got a couple of things bubbling away that I think is super exciting for that as well. So stay tuned for all of those things. Give me a follow on social media as always at NorthPod Show. And I will speak to you in the coming days. Go North. Thanks for listening to another episode of NorthPod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at NorthPod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.